I knew something was rotten. The second they handed out champagne flutes with efficiency as elegance engraved on the glass. We were at a lakeside resort in Vermont, a place where a Hallmark movie had swallowed a corporate tax write-off. The trees were painted in the sharp reds and oranges of late autumn, reflecting off the cold water of the lake like a warning. The chief executive officer, Preston Thorne, a man with bleached teeth and the cadence of a social media influencer, was strutting around in his gray wool shoes like he had personally saved the world from climate change with a single speech. He had flown us all out here, every director, vice president, and human resources coordinator, under the guise of a leadership summit. What he really meant was corporate purging, but with expensive cheese boards. And I, Harvey Vance, 48 years old, vice president of strategic development for the last 11 years, got to watch the blade fall. I was the one who had built our data analytics division from a small team of 3 graduates into a $60 million profit engine. And this was my reward. The execution happened halfway through the opening keynote address. The room was dark, filled with artificial fog and the loud thumping of a popular rock song. Preston walked onto the stage, wearing a casual sweater and a billion-dollar smile. He clapped his hands together like a life coach and announced that the company was entering a bold new era of efficiency. Then he said, "My name." He smiled wider when he did it, saying we were realigning legacy roles to optimize our fiscal footprint. He said I had served the company well, and that I was now free to pursue other opportunities outside our walls. In front of 200 of my peers, clients, and colleagues I had personally hired and trained, my access badge was deactivated. A security guard led me to a waiting golf cart to carry me away like a contestant, kicked off a reality television show. People applauded. That is the part that stays with me, the hollow patter of their hands. Some looked sick, like my assistant Claire Miller, who was crying behind her dark glasses. But others were already calculating how to split my office space back at headquarters. Now, if you are still listening to my story, I should mention that 95% of people who hear these stories forget to subscribe. If you have ever been blindsided by a smiling boss in a fancy mountain lodge, or if you just enjoy watching corporate egos burn to the ground, hit that button. It helps me reach my first 10,000 subscribers, which is worth more to me than Preston's entire grooming budget. Back to the execution. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even finish my champagne. I stood there, my fingernails pressing into my palms until they left red marks, while Preston transitioned to a slide about synergy. My name was never mentioned again. I was replaced by a junior intern before my golf cart even reached the main gate. They thought I would walk away quietly into retirement. They always do. But as I rolled my bag across the gravel, clicking like a clock ticking down, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number with a single text message. "Are you free? Let's ruin him." The message was from Winston Gable, our largest institutional investor. He was a man who once told me I had a calculator for a heart and ice in my veins. Suddenly, the resort did not feel so peaceful. It felt like a war zone. Winston did not meet in coffee shops. When his assistant sent me an address, I expected a high-rise office building in Manhattan. Instead, I found myself walking toward a weather-beaten wooden dock house perched over Lake Champlain. It smelled of gasoline and dry wood. Winston was sitting in a weathered wooden chair, tossing breadcrumbs to a flock of ducks like he did not own half the shares on the stock exchange. He did not stand up when I arrived. He just looked at me and said that Preston had actually done it. I stood there in my suit and dress shoes, feeling the cold lake breeze on my face. I asked him if this was some kind of test of my loyalty. He snorted, telling me that Preston could not spell efficiency without a team of consultants and a scapegoat. He pointed to the empty chair next to him and asked how much I hated the man. The question caught me off guard. The truth was, I did not hate Preston yet. I had respected him once. In fact, I was the one who hired him when he was just a young manager with a sharp mind for numbers and no visible conscience. But over the last 2 years, he had changed. He had started reading too many business blogs, speaking in complicated jargon, and surrounding himself with yes-men who thought virtual emojis were a substitute for real leadership. I told Winston I was not interested in a simple revenge story and that I would not be a pawn in his boardroom battle. Winston leaned forward, his eyes sharp. He told me he was not offering a story. He was offering justice. He revealed that Preston had been misreporting financial data to the shareholders and inflating valuations with fake projections. His team of analysts had been watching him for months, and now they had the evidence. That made me sit down. The battle had officially begun. Winston reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek black tablet. He slid it across the wooden table, tilting the screen toward me. It was filled with spreadsheets, internal memos, and emails that had been deleted from the company's servers the moment my badge was turned off. He explained that Preston had pushed me out because I was the last adult in the room. I was the one who looked at real numbers, which made me a direct threat to a man whose entire corporate empire was built on illusions. I scrolled through the pages, seeing the discrepancies. There were user growth figures that had been doubled behind the scenes, revenue projections that were placed 2 quarters ahead of actual product development, and a hidden folder labeled Project Phantom. The documents showed that Preston was building a house of cards. Winston told me that my public firing gave us the perfect cover. The business press would pay attention if a longtime vice president spoke out. But we had to be smart, controlled, and quiet. He would be the hammer, but I had to be the investigator. I should have said no. I should have taken my severance pay, found a quiet consulting job, and spent my weekends playing golf. But I felt a spark of anger that I could not ignore. I was not ready to be discarded by a younger man who had used my hard work to build his reputation. I looked at Winston and asked what he wanted from me. He said he needed my memory, my knowledge of the files, and my absolute discretion. We were building a case, not just for the board of directors, but for the federal regulators. He promised that when this was over, my name would be cleared, and I would have the chance to watch Preston's career collapse. I agreed. We shook hands on that cold dock, 2 men united by a shared target. The flight back to the city felt like a transition. I sat in a middle seat surrounded by quiet passengers, with the image of Preston's smiling face stuck in my mind. When I unlocked my front door, the silence of my apartment felt heavy. I opened my personal computer and tried to log into the company network, but the screen immediately displayed a message saying my account had been deactivated. My professional email, my health insurance portal, and my project folders were all gone. It was as if 11 years of my life had been erased in an instant. A few hours later, I received an email from the Human Resources Department on my personal account. It contained a complicated severance agreement. They were offering me 6 months of pay, but only if I signed a strict non-disclosure agreement within 72 hours. The contract was full of warnings about arbitration and proprietary knowledge. It was designed to keep me silent. I did not sign it. Instead, I poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the dark screen. At 1 o'clock in the morning, my phone lit up with the encrypted text. It was from Claire, my former assistant. She wrote that she knew I was not finished and that she wanted to help. She told me to meet her at a diner 2 towns over the next morning and to delete the message. When I walked into the diner, Claire was sitting in a corner booth, wearing sunglasses and watching the entrance. She looked nervous, like she was participating in a spy operation. She told me that Preston had already started erasing my name from the internal databases and reassigning my projects to a young intern from an Ivy League school. Someone had even deleted my archived research folders. She reached into her bag and slid a small silver flash drive under the table. She had backed up all my key reports and performance reviews from the last quarter before they could block her access. I took the drive and went back to my apartment. I plugged it into an old laptop that was not connected to the internet. As I analyzed the spreadsheets, I realized the fraud was much worse than I had thought. Preston had not just changed the forecasts. He had actively falsified my approval on reports I had never seen. He had taken my name and placed it on documents that claimed our new software was ready for market when it was still in the testing phase. He had used my reputation as a shield to hide his lies from the investors. I sat there in the dark, feeling a cold rage. This was not just a corporate disagreement. It was fraud. I called Winston at 3 o'clock in the morning and told him I had found the evidence. He told me it was time to start gathering the rest of the puzzle pieces. I looked at the silver drive, ready to dismantle the man who had tried to destroy me. As I worked through the early hours, I thought about the years I had spent helping Preston climb the ladder. I had defended his decisions to the board, mentored his early teams, and shared my technical insights with him. To see that same knowledge used to lock me out of my own division was a deep betrayal. The whiskey burned my throat, but it cleared my head. I realized that my loyalty had been misplaced. This was no longer about playing by the rules of a game that Preston had already rigged. It was about creating a new set of rules where the truth could not be ignored. I shut down the backup laptop and prepared for a long week of investigation, knowing that the steps I took next would determine whether I recovered my life or lost it completely to the corporate shadows. The search for evidence began with a private document I had kept over the years, which was a detailed list of former employees who had left the company under strange circumstances. I decided to contact them one by one from a secure phone line. I did not send emails or text messages, as those could easily be tracked by the security systems. Instead, I wanted to hear their voices and understand the exact reasons for their sudden departures. The first person I called was Rachel Mendoza, the former head of product development. She had been dismissed a year ago for failing to align with the new vision. When she heard my voice, she let out a dry, bitter laugh. Rachel spent 20 minutes explaining the exact moment she knew the company had lost its way. She described a meeting where Preston had demanded that we project a growth rate that defied the laws of physics. When she pointed out that our databases could not handle that volume of traffic, he had simply smiled and said that engineering details were for later, while fundraising was the reality of now. She told me she felt a sense of relief when they finally let her go because she could no longer sleep at night knowing the lies they were telling to the public. Next, I contacted Oscar Grant, our former lead systems engineer. Oscar was a man of few words, but the anger in his voice was clear. He told me that when he looked at the database transactions, he noticed a recurring series of entries that did not match any real customer activity. Every Friday night, a script was run that created thousands of simulated accounts, each showing a tiny amount of activity. When he raised this with the security team, they told him it was just a load test. But when he tracked the data, he saw it was being included in the active user reports sent to the board. 2 days after he raised this issue, he was locked out of his workstation, and security guards stood over him while he packed his coffee mug and his desk plant. He had been blacklisted in the industry, unable to find work for 9 months because the company claimed he had compromised internal databases. He was more than willing to share his files. Then Toby Park came forward. Toby was a young analyst who had been hired straight out of college. He told me he had kept a backup of the presentation shown to the board. The slides showed Nova Core as our primary growth engine, claiming it had $12 million in annual recurring revenue. Toby explained that when he asked for the server logs to verify the numbers, he was told by a senior vice president to focus on his own tasks if he wanted to keep his bonus. The metadata on the files proved that the presentations had been modified on Preston's personal computer, with the fake numbers hand-copied from a scratch pad. Claire was our eyes on the inside. She agreed to get the raw logs from the server room, but the risk was immense. The company had installed new monitoring software that flagged any large file transfers. She had to use an old server terminal in the basement storage room, where the old backup tapes were kept. She called me at midnight from a burner phone, her voice shaking with fear. She said she was standing in the dark room, listening to the hum of the cooling fans and the slow click of the printer. A security manager had walked past, and she had to hide behind a stack of old monitors until he left. She managed to print the logs, showing that Nova Core had 0 server activity, but her account was flagged for review the next morning. She was locked out of the system, but the paper files were safe in her bag. The net was closing, and Preston was starting to realize someone was collecting his secrets. I called Winston and told him we had the proof of a systemic fraud. He told me to keep the files safe and wait for the right moment to strike. We now had a complete record of the fake product pipeline, the falsified board presentations, and the signatures that Preston had forged to bypass the internal auditors. To make our files even more secure, I spent the rest of the night cross-referencing our data with the public financial statements of the past 6 quarters. I found that the company had consistently overstated its capital reserves by utilizing a network of shell corporations that moved funds in a circular pattern to create the appearance of active cash flow. The complexity of this scheme suggested that Preston had hired outside financial consultants to help him obscure the paper trail. It was clear that he was trying to inflate the stock price before the rumors of an impending sale became public. Every document we assembled was a critical piece of the puzzle, and I knew that once we presented this to the federal authorities, there would be no escape for him. I sat by the window as the sun began to rise, feeling the heavy burden of what we were about to do, but also a deep sense of clarity. The company I had helped build was being used for a massive fraud, and I was the only one who could stop it from collapsing entirely. Winston's lawyers helped us set up the final trap. We created a temporary investment group called Verdant Axis, presenting it as a European technology fund looking to buy a stake in our firm. We hired an actor to play the role of the chief technology officer and set up a private video conference with Preston. I participated in the call under a different name, wearing a new suit and sitting in a rented office with a plain background. When Preston's face appeared on the screen, I felt a cold calm. He did not recognize me with my new glasses and shorter hair, or perhaps his arrogance simply prevented him from seeing the man he had fired. He began his presentation, leaning back in his leather chair and speaking with absolute confidence. He boasted that Nova Core was growing at 60% quarter over quarter, and that the application programming interfaces were fully active. He claimed they had secured partnerships with major retail brands, none of which were true. Every word of the conference call was recorded by Winston's compliance experts. We captured his voice, his presentation slides, and the chat logs. It was clear, undeniable evidence of material misrepresentation. After the call ended, I sent the file to Winston. He called me immediately, his voice filled with excitement. He told me we had enough evidence to involve the regulators, but we had to act quickly. Preston was secretly negotiating a sale of the company to a European conglomerate named Aurealis. He was trying to finalize the transaction within 3 weeks, hoping to walk away with a $40 million payout before the fraud was discovered. If the sale went through, the company would be dismantled, hundreds of employees would lose their jobs, and Preston would escape with a fortune. I knew I had to stop him. That night, I made the decision to submit a formal whistleblower complaint to the authorities. I filed the report under the provisions of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, specifically referencing Title 15, United States Code, Section 1514A, which protects employees who report financial fraud from retaliation. I also cited Title 18, United States Code, Section 1348, detailing the securities fraud. I attached the database logs, the presentation slides, and the recording of the fake investment call. The next morning, I sent the same information to Natalie Brooks, a respected investigative reporter at the Atlantic Ledger. I knew that the legal process would take time, but a public story would force the board to act immediately. Natalie was thorough. She spent 24 hours verifying the documents and contacting her sources. The headline appeared on the front page of the business section the following morning: Ghost Products and Phantom Revenue Inside Thorn Group. The article was a devastating analysis of Preston's tenure. It detailed the fake software, the falsified board presentations, and the systematic removal of employees who questioned the numbers. Within hours, the story was shared across every professional network. The company's internal communication channels were shut down, and employees were left in a state of panic. Preston tried to defend himself by publishing a statement on a small business website claiming that I was a disgruntled former employee who had been investigated for taking company funds. It was a desperate lie, but it did not work. The evidence was too strong, and the public had already made its decision. Winston called me to say he had scheduled an emergency board meeting. The final confrontation was set, and I was ready to walk back into the building that had dejected me. As I prepared for the meeting, I met with Winston's legal team to review the potential consequences for the company. We knew that the public disclosure of fraud would cause the stock price to drop significantly, but it was the only way to prevent the Aurealis acquisition from destroying the jobs of the remaining staff. The lawyers assured me that by filing the whistleblower complaint under federal protection, we had insulated the company from certain immediate liabilities. We spent hours drafting a recovery plan, outlining the steps to stabilize the operations once Preston was removed. I felt a deep sense of responsibility for the people who still worked there, the engineers and analysts who had trusted me over the years. This was no longer just about defeating Preston. It was about preserving the division I had dedicated my career to building. I looked at the city lights outside the office window, knowing that the next day would decide the future of the company and my own place within it. In the final hours before the board meeting, Natalie called me to confirm that the regulators had already issued a formal request for information to the company's legal counsel. The SEC was acting faster than we had anticipated, likely driven by the public outcry following the published article. I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety as I realized the wheels of justice were turning. I reviewed the recovery slides one last time with Winston on a secure video link. He looked tired but determined, telling me that the board members were already calling him to ask how they could minimize their own legal exposure. I told him we would offer them a clear path forward, but only if they voted to remove Preston immediately. The trap was set, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the morning to arrive. The boardroom on the 22nd floor was silent when I walked in. 12 members of the board sat around the long wooden table, looking at their computers with expressions of panic. Preston was standing at the end of the room, his tie slightly loose, trying to convince them that the news article was nothing but a coordinated attack by a bitter former vice president. He insisted that Nova Core was a real product in stealth development and that the revenue projections were based on early customer interest. He was still trying to use his charm, but the board members were no longer listening. Winston sat at the other end of the table, his arms crossed, waiting for his moment. He tapped his tablet, and the recording of the Verdant Axis conference call began to play. Preston's voice filled the room, boasting about active systems and fake partnerships. Preston's face turned pale as he heard his own words. He demanded to know who had authorized the recording, but Winston ignored the question. He looked at the board and said that Preston had lied to the investors and to them. That was the moment the door opened, and I walked in, carrying a box of files labeled with the company's real data. I placed the documents on the table. They contained the original database entries, the letters from former employees, and the proof that my signature had been forged on the financial reports. I looked at Preston and told him to stop talking, because every word he spoke was only making his legal situation worse. The board members began flipping through the binders. Evelyn Rothsky, a longtime member, shook her head and muttered that it was a clear breach of fiduciary duty. George Finch and Diana Cross agreed, looking at Preston with disgust. Winston called for an immediate vote to terminate Preston's contract for cause without any severance pay. All 12 hands went up. Preston stood there for a moment, looking at the people who had supported him just a week ago, then walked out of the room in silence. He had gone from a celebrated chief executive to an unemployed defendant in less than an hour. Once the room cleared, Winston handed me a document appointing me as the interim chief executive officer. I looked at the signature line and signed my name. I did not do it for the title or the money. I did it to protect the company we had built and to ensure that the employees who remained would have a future. My first week as interim leader was spent cleaning up the damage. I canceled the sale to Aurealis, met with the engineers to rebuild their trust, and established a transparent financial reporting system. I did not make any speeches or post on social media. I simply focused on the work. On my last day in the temporary office, Claire came in and handed me a final file she had retrieved from the compliance server. It contained emails showing that Preston had tried to remove my name from 3 patents we had filed for our data visualization software, attempting to take the credit for himself. This was a clear violation of Title 35, United States Code, Section 256, which governs the correction of named inventors. I smiled, seeing the final proof of his pettiness. I closed the laptop, knowing that justice had been served. Preston had sought efficiency at the cost of honesty, but in the end, the truth was the most efficient tool of all. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more accounts of corporate survival, make sure to subscribe and support the channel. I will continue to share these stories of justice and truth. In the days that followed my appointment, the board confirmed my role as the permanent chief executive officer. We faced months of intense regulatory scrutiny, but because we had initiated the investigation ourselves, the authorities worked with us to resolve the outstanding compliance issues. The stock price began to recover as investors realized that the core technology of the company was still solid. I relocated my office to a smaller room on the 10th floor, closer to the engineering team. I did not need the mahogany table or the view of the skyline to do my job. We rebuilt the company on a foundation of real numbers and honest work, and for the first time in years, the employees felt secure in their roles. Preston faced multiple federal charges for securities fraud, and his assets were frozen during the legal proceedings. His fall was complete, but the organization survived because we chose to stand for the truth. I stood on the small balcony of my new office, looking down at the city streets, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. The battle was over, and the company was finally in safe hands. To prevent any future occurrences, I established an independent audit committee that reported directly to the board, ensuring that no single executive could alter the financial statements without multiple layers of verification. I also reached out to the former employees we had contacted during the investigation, offering them their old roles back with full compensation for their lost time. Rachel and Oscar returned to the firm, bringing their experience and dedication back to the divisions they had helped create. Claire was promoted to Director of Operations, a role she had earned through her courage and loyalty. As I sat in the engineering lab on a Friday afternoon, watching the team collaborate on a new project that was based on actual code and real client feedback, I knew we had succeeded. We had not just removed a corrupt leader, we had saved the soul of the company. The journey had been difficult, but the resolution was complete, and we were ready to face the future with confidence.